Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 3 of Sheffield Debating. My name is Will. I'm going to be your host again for this session. So a little bit about me. It has been a few months. I'm very sorry. A lot has happened with the society and sort of like mostly running it by myself for a large amount of that time. So I didn't actually have time to be able to properly delegate this sort of session. But now, sort of like we're getting into the competitive side of things, and more people are gaining interest and sort of helping out. So I do have a bit more hands on deck, which means I can actually take more time and actually be able to dedicate this and continue this series, which I have very much missed. So just again, I am the secretary of the Debate Society here of the University of Sheffield, and sort of this year, starting from September, a lot of my time has been spent CAing. So I'm doing a lot of chairing, a lot of judging, and that sort of allowed me to, that's slightly guided sort of how I want to continue this series. Sort of taking in the feedback I have personally witnessed, but also just what people talking to me. I found that whilst people are now getting a good grasp of BP, um, the biggest part people seem to be struggling on is the technical knowledge. Is that unfortunately, as part of BP, whilst you can have intuitive arguments, it's that intuition has to come from somewhere. You can't simply have intuition if you don't have knowledge, the prerequisite knowledge to be able to substantiate any sort of formulation of arguments. So this is what this episode is going to be focusing on. We are going to be discussing one of the probably most important and most common themes we see in BP debating, which is economics. So we're going to jump straight into it, and sort of for this session, whilst I'm not going to be going through specific BP motions, what I am going to be doing is really trying to explain. I've tried to collate a good amount of economic sort of philosophies and ideas that are the most common and things I've experienced with, and maybe just like throwing in like a few other things in there as well, just to really help you guys sort of being able to generate these new ideas and just having a basic grasp. Do bear with me in this, because whilst I would and love to be able to teach you and give all of my knowledge on the subject, unfortunately economics is, you can do an entire degree out of this. It is 3-4 years for a typical undergraduate. I'm including a master's on this, and I am not going to be spending 3 years on a YouTube video. I doubt you guys would even want to see that. If you were interested enough, you probably know enough about economics already. But this is just for those people sort of like who maybe getting used to BP or just want like a good refresher on economic sort of principles and ideas. So that's really the aim of the session. So just go into the session with this in mind. Okay, so let's start off with what economics actually is. So economics is a huge field of study, and it sort of looks at how individuals, businesses, governments, and just nations overall sort of make choices on allocating resources to help satisfy demand. So just in a nutshell, it's money and resources. That's it. That's all it is. Um, to sort of just dive a little bit deep into that on the resources and demand part, because it is good to sort of remember that there are limited resources. So this is economics doesn't just look at, okay, what the theory of infinite resources. There are finite resources on planet Earth, and so therefore, but the demand is typically almost really considered infinite. It's all like you have 8 billion people, and those 8 billion people have 8 billion different demands. So demand is always increasing, especially with sort of innovation and sort of developing new ideas. People always want more. So you have a demand which is constantly increasing, but a resource capacity which cannot meet and cannot do that, like cannot keep up with demand. So therefore, sort of economics looks at what is the most efficient way sort of entities are able to allocate those resources, and why do they allocate resources in a particular way. Which is actually kind of what we're going to go into now. I would really say that in terms of the way in which humans have organized society, they've organized it into 3 sort of main economic structures that are overarching. There are countless different ways to set up and sort of the micro sort of ways in which you can organize an economy, but I'm going to go over the 3 main sort of big ones. The first one, capitalism. I'm sure we've all heard of capitalism, But let's actually go into it. So capitalism is just an economic sort of system whereby the means of production are controlled by private owners for profit. That is capitalism in its purest form. It's just simply that private businesses, private housing is owned by the people and it is not owned by the government. So, what are some of the advantages of having this sort of system? Well, you get an enormous amount of innovation and productivity. Is that when you do not have sort of a centralized system, or like for example in the government, you get far less red tape, which means that decisions can be made quicker. People can go into specialties. People can start up their own ideas. We also see a large amount of economic growth in these sorts of in capitalist societies, and that's sort of the way in which it's set up. It's set up where capitalism looks at being able to meet that constant demand and that sort of not just the basic needs, but those additional needs, and therefore that promotes growth in these economies. It's also extremely efficient. When we take a look at governments, I'm sure we all know, governments typically are very inefficient. They are extremely bureaucratic and can take very long to make decisions. Businesses are far quicker, typically because instead of having a million different things businesses have to focus on, they can focus on they can specialize essentially in one or two different things. So Google is not building roads. Google is not, building hospitals. They are focusing primarily on technology. So that they leave that to someone else. So instead of having a centralized system focusing on so many different areas, businesses can simply specialize. That's a really big advantage of having businesses. The disadvantages of this, I'm sure many of you probably already know this, but capitalism is a system where there is huge wealth inequality gaps. So why does this occur? Well, wealth disparity occurs simply because capitalism is a system where the whole point is to get richer, but not everyone can be rich, because otherwise that would be a different system, which we're going to move into. Instead, capitalism relies upon the fact that some people are simply better than others. You are rewarded for your hard work, and therefore there has to be a disparity in wealth. But what we can see now in the modern system is that that wealth gap is continuously increasing. And this then moves on to the second point. And how do they do this? They primarily do this through exploitation. So this can either be exploitation of workers, like paying them, either like having a offloading work to other nations, typically third world nations. So a lot of large brands do this. So that might be H&M, Zara. They will often have like factories in Bangladesh, India, and they all utilize child labor. So capitalism has a sort of almost it takes a lot of inspiration from the idea of colonialism and sort of like oppressing those in less fortunate conditions to benefit one's own nation. That's one way in which capitalism does it. And we also get environmental degradation. Because capitalism is primarily for profit, and that the idea that shareholders are the most important people, which we will move on to in a bit. Essentially what we get is a system which prioritizes the generation and accumulation of wealth more than anything else. So that's capitalism in a nutshell. So advantages are really great for innovation, typically very efficient, and you get rapid economic growth. The downsides of it is that you get wealth gaps, you get huge amounts of exploitation, and this typically comes at the cost of people's sort of humanity, and you also get a huge amount of pollution and environmental degradation. That's what we sort of get from capitalism. So what is the second economic system we can look at? Well, we can look at socialism. And just to clarify, socialism can mean a lot of different things to different people. But this is the classical sort of just view of what socialism. This is just socialism in its most basic form. So socialism is a system where the ownership of private property is allowed, but the means of production, instead of being in the hands of the people, are now either collectively owned or they are government owned. And I just want to make this real quick distinction. So what I mean by collectively owned is, instead of a business where you have a primary shareholder, you have a CEO and you might have the vast majority of the shares of a company are controlled by a conglomerate of like tightly knit, like extremely wealthy individuals. What a system you can have is you can have a system where everyone has an equal share in the business. So the floor worker has the same amount as the boss. And what this system basically says everyone is equal. No one is allowed to get a huge step up on wealth gap, and no one can exploit that wealth. So you can either have businesses which are collectively owned like that, or you can just have it where it's government owned. So the government controls the means of productions. Now, socialism is often conflated with communism. There are big distinctions between this. Is typically socialism can actually there are models of socialism that can actually work in sort of in the capitalist system. And it advocates more so not for a drastic, immediate, almost rebellious change of power. It's a slow, gradual sort of change of power, and it looks more so at not the profit side, but the human side, and sort of like taking a look at the other stakeholders involved in human affairs. So some of the advantages of this is that we get a larger increase in income equality. So it might be wages are balanced out more, as that CEOs or cannot have wages 100 times more than that of their floor worker. It might be increased taxation so the more that you earn, so it's a progressive tax system, which basically means that you get better social welfare systems, as sort of like the government spends more on the foundations. So rather than spending money on letting businesses improve, as you improve the foundation of where people live, and that sort of like lifts and elevates everyone else up in society. And we also get lower amounts of exploitation. This primarily is because the government works for the people and is ran by the people, instead of individual businesses who put their own priorities beyond what the common average person essentially wants. So that's why we get lower exploitation. Disadvantages of socialism is that it is, compared to the capitalist model, it is far less economically inefficient, because you're almost stagnating growth in businesses. So because you do not have these individuals who sort of are able to use, and the reason why capitalism sort of is able to grow so quickly is because, as I said, of that exploitation factor. So since you're actually not exploiting either resources or people or geographical location nearly as much, you are essentially getting slower and less efficient economic growth. So that's one part. There's also a huge amount of bureaucracy and red tape. It's sort of when you have a centralized power that has, it's instead of a flat structure, it's very hierarchical. And when that's spread across all industries, that can become very difficult to keep track of. And it just means that there is more and more things you have to go through, so things get approved slower. And we also get less innovation, is because everything is controlled in a central place. You don't get that sort of spark of competition, as the businesses aren't wanting to compete with one another, is because there's no tangible reward for that. So in the current system, is if you create a new idea that can compete with others and your product performs better, you are rewarded with more wealth. But when you have it in a centralized system, even if you bring forth these new ideas, you are not going to gain a huge amount of wealth in comparison. So people are less likely to simply reach out for these ideas in sort of not all fields, maybe like in the medical fields, for example. People will spark up because their motivation lies not in money but in helping people out. But in sort of profit orientated industries, we will get less innovation. So that's the socialism. And then just to quickly expand upon what I meant by sort of like different forms of socialism, it does, as I say, encompass a wide range of different things. So in the most basic form, it's just the state ownership of means of production. Now, socialism can work with democracy. So democratic socialism is when you use democratic processes to achieve a socialist system. Is that essentially people vote in these sort of socialist policies and social reforms, and eventually you shift the economy, instead of being capitalist and privately orientated, to publicly owned. We also have social democracy. So typically this is a system that operates within the capitalist framework. So I think a very good example of this would be someone like Zoran Mamdani, who is the new New York City mayor. He would be classed as a social democrat. So whilst they agree that okay, maybe we should have capitalist model because it's efficient, but what we're going to have is we still care about people. So there's going to be this typically looks like very high taxation, strong progressive taxation. So we might hear often tax the billionaires, tax millionaires. There is going to be far more stringent regulation for the average business, just to make sure that people are being protected. And there's a very strong welfare state as well. So that might look like universal healthcare, universal childcare. So even though it operates on a capitalist model of okay, you need products and you need private ownership and the growth, that is heavily the state also heavily subsidizes those basic needs. Typically, that might look like sort of is almost like the Nordic model, essentially what we might see in like Scandinavian countries. That's sort of like that's sort of like how social democracy sort of works. So I hope that's clear. Moving on to the big one everyone loves to talk about is communism. So this was based, I'm sure all of you heard, it's primarily based on the work of Karl Marx. And it's basically just a system where all means of production are controlled by the state. Communism does not agree with the notion of private property, and sort of the eventual end goal of communism is to have a classless society and eventually sort of like a dissolvement of government. So people basically work for themselves and they work for the state. So instead of working for your own profit, you work for society. Advantages of this model is that you do get access to basic needs. The state says, okay, everyone needs to have the same basic level. That might be housing, food, healthcare. It's a model which heavily prioritizes on equality and equity. So it looks at it. Communism and sort of basically says, well, people are not born equally. People have different talents. So that's not fair. There's an inherent disadvantage to people. People should, instead of using that for their own gain, they should be using that for the progression of society overall. And there's also sort of, it eliminates this profit drive that we get. So all of those negatives that you get with a profit-driven organizations, you don't get in the communist system. Big disadvantages of communism is one, you get a huge loss of individual freedom. So when you were in a debate and someone might be arguing for communism, that might be that you would have to argue. You could make the argument that okay, you lose individual freedom, but then you would also have to explain why individual freedom is even important in the first place. You get authoritarianism. So typically, because you have these single parties. For example, what we might see in North Korea, China. Even though China is called the Chinese Communist Party, China is more so like a social democracy, sort of in a way. Even though it's a one party, it still sort of operates partially under a capitalist model. But what we do get is in previous states, for example, in the USSR, you get a large amount of authoritarianisms, even though that might not be what what the idea is that's typically what has been seen in sort of previous examples. And finally, we get economic inefficiency. So again, sort of the same disadvantages of socialism, where because the government controls everything, it's sort of industries and businesses can't specifically invest in niche aspects. So you don't have a specific companies that build roads or hospitals, or you don't have those construction companies, or you don't have ones that operate with lawyers, financing. Is that's sort of all centralized into one area, and you get that sort of bureaucracy. Another big critique of communism is that communism is not seen as a model which sort of can interact well, and just apparent and critiques argue that it does not conform to human nature. Essentially, it argues that communism is sort of idealistic, and whilst it might be a good idea on paper, it can never work in theory. That's another very big critique of communism. And just to add on to the capitalist model, is another critique of capitalism is that it's considered to be sort of long-term unsustainable because of those finite resources. So just to balance out, this is something I'm very much aware of, that I'm trying to not let my own personal biases jump into this. I want to make sure that I'm providing all this to you as neutrally as possible. So, but if I do slip up and I do seem to be sort of deviating towards critiquing something a bit more, I promise you it is just I'm trying my best. Okay, let's move on to economics. And disclaimer, so the majority of what we're going to see sort of relies more so on the capitalist system. This is the most popular system, so therefore it's also the system, for example, in which England takes place in. So it does make sense to understand sort of how the country in England is ran, sort of economically, for this video. But I can make another video and maybe go into more economic policies you might see in more communist or socialist countries. But hopefully I've covered a decent amount. Okay, first things first. Let's go into shares. So shares are simply just pieces of stakes that are available to be publicly traded on stock markets. And the more shares an individual has, the more say they get in the business. And I would say the best way to imagine this is, imagine a company has a big slice of cake and they say, okay, I have this really big slice of cake, but I have no friends to invite me to my birthday party and I want loads of presents. So why don't I just say to people, hey, I have a slice of cake if you bring me something? And that's the way it works. People say, I would like a piece of cake, here you go, and they hand over money. So you can, what you do is, instead of having the entire ownership of the business just with the owners, is that what the owners do is they say, okay, you can publicly buy parts of the business for basically for a price, and that's determined by the stock market. And who determines sort of what the worth of a company is? Well, economists don't even fully know, but typically this looks like if a business is performing well and is considered a viable long-term, maybe safe option, people are more interested to buy those shares. So in a pure nutshell, a share is basically when people can trade parts of the business publicly. They can either sell them or they can buy parts of the shares. What are the advantages of having shares in a business? First one is you get an enormous amount of liquidity. What is liquidity? Liquidity means cash on hand. So when we take a look at things like assets, for example, you can have long-term assets. So this might be things like businesses, it might be car leases, I can't think of any other examples right now, but you also get sort of short-term assets, and these are assets which can easily be turned around and formed into liquid cash, and this basically means you get an increased amount of purchasing power. So whilst a company might have huge amounts of long-term assets, their buying power actually might be really weak because they have no cash. So what this does is basically they give up part of their shares and they get loads of money in return. Another big thing is, in terms of shares, compared to other ways of obtaining liquid cash, for example, a bank loan, you don't actually have to repay. So people are buying your product. Shares can be imagined as like a product a business sells. So a business simply just gets these payments, and they don't have to pay anyone back. There's no interest rate, there's no due date, they have to repay it. They simply get liquid cash into their business, and yeah, it's a very effective way of quickly generating capital into your injecting capital into your business. Finally, in order to sell shares on the stock exchanges, for example, like on the Nasdaq or London Stock Exchange, you have to have something known as limited liability. So there are two types. You can have different types of businesses. So if you're a privately owned business, you can dilute shares within your own organization, but not publicly list them. However, if you are to have shares sold publicly listed, typically this looks like having something known as a limited liability company, so like an LLC. And what this means is that if your company, for whatever reason, is sued, you are not personally liable. So when the debt collectors come, they can only take assets away from the business, they cannot take your personal assets. Okay, so what are the disadvantages of shares in the first place? Well, first of all, you get an insane amount of market volatility. The shares are a very good way of measuring how much a company is worth, but there are a large amount of factors, and as scary as it is to say, many of these factors simply cannot be measured. That's what makes the stock market a true gamble. No one can figure out because there are so many variables at play. You aren't going to know everything that's affecting a business. So this could actually affect sort of how the reputation of your business essentially is suddenly your stock prices plummet because investors have no confidence in your business. That can affect other aspects of your business as well. Secondly, you get a loss of control. So depending upon how many shares you let being bought up without you owning a stake, you can lose entire control of your business. You can start a business from the ground up, and you can give all the shares out and out to publicly sell, and someone can buy. And typically, this is that you have a primary stakeholder, and if anyone owns over 50% of the business, they become essentially the new owner of the business. So you lose control of your business. Even if you don't give out 100% and you still retain the 50%, you have to listen to those other people who might own a 10% or a 5%, 20% stake. If you own like a 0.00001% stake in a business, no one gives a shit about you, no one's going to listen to you. But the more you own, the more leverage you get over the business. So you lose control of your business. And finally, what we see is when a organization is sort of for these for-profit organizations, the shareholders have a very similar mindset. They want your business to be profitable. The more profitable you are, the higher their share price goes, meaning they get more money. So what we see is many organizations start to no longer prioritize the needs of their consumers, and they begin to prioritize the need of their shareholders. This has a very, very dangerous sort of precedence because this means that organizations might no longer they're less likely to invest in sort of things like public causes because that might not generate immediate income. Whereas if they started to buy up new factories and in foreign countries, for example, for very cheaply, and then they can manufacture their own products and sell to a wider consumer base, it basically it deviates and you get a more profit incentive business compared to one that might have been more likely to have had more social causes and sort of positive perceptions. So that's what we get. Um, Moving on, there's a concept in business known as economies of scale. So this is just the mass production of a product through building hyper efficient, I mean hyper efficient supply chains, which reduces the cost of individual items. These supply chains often operate multinational, so they're not operating in a purely one country. We're going to get onto why that is the case later on. But for now, it's just typically supply chains operate vastly, typically across the world. And the advantages of this is that these provide very, very cheap goods. I'm sure if you've seen someone like been to someone like Costco, they are the perfect example of what economies of scale efficiently looks like. Costco, you can bulk buy from Costco because the individual item, because it starts to get really cheap to buy in bulk because businesses can mass produce products far cheaper. It's incredibly accessible worldwide in terms of the products it sells. So, for example, if you had a business and the cost to create, let's go for someone like, oh, I don't know, I'm blanking. But if let's say you were selling, let's go back to 2020. If you were selling COVID vaccines, okay, and you were producing COVID vaccines, and it costs £100 to produce these vaccines, governments are far less likely to buy up if instead your competitor has vastly superior supply chains and they can manufacture the product very rapidly at a very cheap price. They might be able to manufacture it and sell it for £5 a hit. So what you get is essentially products become rapidly available worldwide very, very quickly. I mean, another example would be like Bluetooth headphones. I'm sure we all remember when we used to have wired headphones. I mean, my phone doesn't even have like a plug socket, like so the not a plug socket. God, I wouldn't be able to charge it. The headphone jack in it anymore, and that's because the Bluetooth headphones became so widely accessible so quickly worldwide because these supply chains quickly mass manufacture these products and suddenly became very cheap. And we also get an enormous amount of market resilience. It's sort of like when instead of if markets start to become volatile, you still have these supply chains and these extensive supply chains in place. And this produces a large amount of jobs for people across the world, which actually helps to keep money circulating within the economy. So rather than relying upon small independent businesses that might have high costs, these big businesses are able to take on the large costs and they can continue having large amounts of workers. What are the disadvantages of economies of scale? I know I've talked quite a bit about the advantages, and there are plenty, and it's a very, very common subject you'll find. One is that you're going to get typically you get a lot of exploitative labor. As I mentioned before, sort of my example with H&M, Zara, is these businesses are operating the maybe like the raw material side of their supply chains or like the secondary stage of their supply chains in third world nations that utilize either child or slave or just very cheap labor that is not would not be okay in the well, anyone would consider okay. So and they do that because they're profit driven. Secondly is environmental concerns. Even though you have all these cheap goods and it's very accessible worldwide, it takes up natural resources. We are not currently in the status quo. We are not recycling perfectly. Actually, we're not very much recycling comparatively to how much we use versus how much we waste. And what you get is essentially we keep digging up raw materials and we're using far more than what we have. And this can cause huge amounts of environmental concerns. For example, utilization of plastic, which needs fossil fuels, and that causes you to drill, and that causes leakages, etc. And there's also concerns over control. So the way in which these supply chains work is businesses can either own or not own these supply chains. So it might be you actually import from a factory you don't even own and actually supplies to your competitor, because it is far cheaper to simply have someone supply to you and have them build the factory than you build it by yourself. The main reason why this is the case is because it is economically more viable, in the sense that if you owned your own factory and then your business went tits up, you suddenly have this huge fucking factory that you can't sell, or it's just a huge asset waste, which could have been used for something else. However, if you were to have as a supplier, and your business was to dip, and you can find a cheaper supplier, you're not suddenly losing money and you can't produce your products anymore. You can simply find someone else. So it's sort of like that's why the control concerns exist. It's simply because most businesses do have no control at all over the sort of their supply chains. Moving on to market regulations. So market regulation is when, first of all, a market is where businesses and customers interact with one another. Just want to get that clear. And these are governed by laws, and the extent to which these laws are regulated and applied vary significantly between country to country. So the UK governs things differently than the US, and the US governs differently to China, to Japan, to Bangladesh, etc. Markets are regulated on a country by country basis. What are the advantages of having a regulated market where a government controls and implements laws to regulate and sort of limit what a business is allowed to do? The first thing you get is you get far less monopolies. And monopolies is, I'm sure you played the game Monopoly, where you're trying to collect everything. You're trying to own the board. And what this does is this centralizes power. And this means that basically a company can decide how much they want to raise a product by, and they control the means of production. So having less monopoly means that prices are typically lowered, consumers have more choice, and you don't get a business which basically gatekeeps everything and charges absurd prices for products. That allows for innovation to occur and for increased competition, sort of like the spirit of the game, essentially. Secondly, we get more consumer protection. When you are regulating a market, this does not just look like what a business can do in terms of like how much they can own, but it's also what they can maybe advertise. So in the UK, we have like the consumer protection law, which basically says a business is not allowed to lie to you on because they want to. So I can't say to you like I can't sell you an energy bar and that says guaranteed to get you abs. Like I can't do that because that's just not true. That's a simple, blatant lie. Um, so what we get in consumer protection is when uh, the most common form of that is just going to look like businesses cannot sort of mislead you on what their product does. They have to typically be very honest, and also especially on the ingredients in which they use as well. So it can't be so. As much as I'm sure we would all love to have cocaine in our Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola do have to say, we haven't got any cocaine. Very sorry about that. They can't lie and say that they do. We also get the advantages of market regulation is we get sort of it addresses environmental concerns. It's sort of when you have a government and the politicians put into place are typically are voted in through democratic processes, and they typically have to conform to the will of the people. Doesn't feel like that, but they do. And what this might be is politicians might say, oh, hold on, we need to address the environmental concerns because that's what is keeping me sort of in politics. That's why I'm not being voted out, and that's why I'm still being voted in, is because I'm promising on these environmental campaigns. So what businesses are regulated to do, is they're regulated to say you cannot waste electricity. You might have to, you might get grants to have like electricity, to have renewable electricity. It might be that you are not allowed to pollute rivers. Basically, it controls how businesses must consider the environment, and they have to do it and adhere to a certain standard. That's what we get. The disadvantages of regulating markets is there is a substantially increased cost. Because businesses have all of these sort of regulations in place, that increases how much they have to spend in the first place. So what that means is businesses have less money to maybe spend on increasing wages, to have invested in research and development, built a new factory. So what we get is businesses just have to spend more, and they have less money to be able to grow rapidly. And that ties into slower innovation, as I said. It's sort of like when you have less research and development, that means that you aren't innovating and you aren't creating nearly enough ideas because you aren't you aren't spending any money on that because you're so focused on ensuring you are regulated properly. And we also get a very interesting one in terms of the compatibility sort of issues in which this might occur. So it might be that a government might implement a policy, and if market regulations are consistently occurring, so let's take a look at the biggest one is environmental concerns, right? So when you have these governments which are consistently introducing new legislature, and they're consistently saying to businesses, hey, this is the old model, you now need to have the new model, and you can't do anything about it. What you get is businesses who might have spent a decent amount of capital investing in these new technologies suddenly have to then spend more money to regulate, so to make sure that they're staying regulated. So what you get is you get this consistent demand and increase. And what this might mean for many businesses, especially smaller businesses, multinationals are able to afford it, and the reason they don't is they just don't care. But let's go hypothetically. They can afford it. They can afford to consistently regulate. Smaller businesses have far more issues with this because it requires a lot of capital to be environmentally friendly. It's far easier to simply just dump all your waste in the river and say, like, that's it, I'm done. No, you have to invest in that infrastructure, and that takes a lot of capital and a lot of resources. So there are compatibility issues on the especially for smaller businesses, especially when markets are consistently updating their regulation. And two ways in which there are two schools of thought when it comes to market regulation. So the first one is it's more so classical liberalism. I should have specified that. And before anyone says like, but I'm a liberal and I want market control, the original concept of liberalism. Well, the liberalism in itself is like French for like freedom. It's sort of like, and so therefore you're free from government. You have less, like the government has less say. It's a concept known as like laissez-faire, which I believe is French for leave well alone. Do correct me. I don't speak French very well. But what we get is in the classical liberalism. I also think neoclassical liberalism. Someone correct me on that. Basically advocates for less control. So this school of thought basically says, well, we should be having less control. The two largest theorists I was able to think of off the top of my head was Adam Smith. He had the concept of the invisible hand, where basically consumers are sort of rational in terms of what they want, and eventually, and it's sort of like their choices guide the market, and that the market does not need to be regulated. We also get Friedman, who basically advocates for the fact that government should only be monitoring sort of the supply of money within the economy, and that they should not be interfering with anything else. Basically, that it should be left up to businesses to sort of regulate the market by themselves, and again, sort of very much taking what Adam Smith also says, with a lot of sort of enhancements and sort of his own ideas jumped onto it. But the largest theorists of Adam Smith and Friedman, they basically just say, don't worry, the government should not have any intervention apart from maybe like in the cases of monetary policy, like sort of like reducing the amount of money so then you get less inflation. That's basically what they argue for. What we get on the socialism side is that they advocate for more control. So this is like Keynesian economics, which basically came after, I do believe it was the 1940s. Again, it's been 2 years since I've done sort of economics, but this basically, this sort of approach to socialism sort of really dismissed Adam Smith's invisible hand, because Adam Smith says that the market guides itself, and that no government intervention is needed, and the market is self-correcting. However, after the Great Depression in the U.S. in the starting from 1928 to like 1936, was it something like that? 33, something like that. Is that basically it showed that the markets are not always self-correcting, that you do need government intervention at some point. And Marx kind of, well, goes into Marxism. It's very interesting. They named the theories after themselves. Very interesting. But Marxism, as we discussed in sort of communism, Marxism basically just goes deep end in this and says the government should control everything. So it's not sort of like Keynesian economics where it's okay, like companies should be for profit, but they should be heavily regulated. It's no one should have freedom. Government should control everything. So that's sort of what the big divide is. We get liberalism, which agrees on advocating for less control. Socialism, which agrees for more control. That's what we get. Okay, moving on. So there's this idea of a comparative advantage. And a comparative advantage is a principle where entities should specialize in producing goods with the lower opportunity cost than competitors. So the way in which I would sort of wrap this around your head is basically it's if you can produce a good very well, better than other people, produce it. That's it. That's all it is. So what are the advantages of this? Well, what you get is you get an increased amount of production. Is if you have the natural resources to do something much better than other people, and you don't have to wait as long to get it, you get an increased amount of production. This also means that you get a lower price because supply is increased, and demand, if demand typically does stay the same when you have, let's assume that demand stays the same, supply increases, well, you get lower amounts of pricing. And you also get a very efficient resource allocation. So instead of having a basically this huge central business that does everything, or government, is instead what you do is you divide and conquer. You delegate everything. So if you say, well, you do something better than I do, you have a comparative advantage, you should produce that resource. So whilst there are definitely advantages to this system, there are, on the other hand, disadvantages. The first one is structural unemployment. So this basically means that when you have a business or a nation which specializes in a sort of specific industry, if that industry suddenly no longer becomes popular, a vast majority of your population suddenly becomes unemployed. So if you just like overproduce like a certain amount, and that kind of moves into the over specialization, which is the Dutch disease. They're sort of intertwined with one another. It's sort of like eventually if you over specialize and then suddenly everything goes to shit, you get massive amounts of structural unemployment. You don't have any sort of like safety net if you go really far into the comparative advantage. And you also have this sort of strategic dependency where you need to, if you are a nation which produces a certain good and you have trade partners, but then suddenly it finds out like another nation is able to trade with someone else who has a better comparative advantage to you, then suddenly you've sort of lost that supply. If you are consistently supplying something and you rely purely upon what is strategically best for other nations, you are very vulnerable to those other nations suddenly changing their minds. Could either be for political reasons, could be for social or economic. So you sort of basically what you get is over specialization is bad. And if you don't regulate it well, and if other people do get an advantage over you and you don't have a contingency, it's not going to end well for you. That's basically the huge disadvantages of comparative advantage. Okay, moving on. What is progressive taxation? So progressive taxation is a principle where individuals who have a larger amount of accumulated wealth and have large amounts of income are taxed as they earn more. So you're taxed as your salary progresses. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Advantages of the system is it reduces inequalities. Instead of taxing people at a base rate for everyone, is that instead what you do is you lower taxes for people who have less money and you increase taxes for those who do. And the reason why this does reduce inequality is because basically you get people who have less income are able to spend more of that income on other things, whereas those who still have a very high income, even if they're taxed more, they still get all the benefits of and they typically do still have a very high salary. This then goes typically into social programs. So this means that you're able to suddenly pay for universal healthcare, childcare, building roads, and maintaining infrastructure. There's also a very, very big argument and a sort of very big leniency, especially in the online space, on the morality aspect of it. And it's if you have more, why not give it up for the social good? And it's this idea of it's morally good. And it's if you have more, why hog it all to yourself when you can give it out and you can benefit the wider community? So it's sort of like on the moral aspect is your own self-interests do not outweigh that which is of society. Is that it's not the individual, it's the collective. The disadvantages of progressive taxation is one, it does disincentivize innovation. Whilst this can be a bit difficult to prove at times, there is a very legitimate sort of concern people do have. It's if they move into a higher tax bracket, is suddenly they're taxed a lot more, or if their business is earning a lot more, then they are almost punished a lot more, even if other people not in that business would not consider it a punishment. It's sort of those people who are being taxed consider it a punishment. They basically have the perception that all my hard work I'm doing is being penalized. I'm being penalized for my intelligence, my brilliance. This is shit. I don't like this. This can actually lead to brain drain in countries. This was, again, going back, very sorry for my callbacks to Zoran Mamdani. I did follow him for a very long time, and I was glued to the screen in the New York elections. But a big part of when you potentially either suggest or implement a progressive taxation system is you might lead to brain drain. So this might be simply, okay, you might have all the rich people in one place, but if you tax them too much, they're going to leave. They're going to want to go somewhere else, essentially. So, they avoid sort of they're able to essentially avoid it, and you don't reap the benefits of taxing them anymore. So you don't even like you get less essentially. That's sort of the argument. It's okay if you just had kept them there, then you get their taxes. But because you increased it too much, you now no longer get their taxes. And we also do see is that it's when you do when you have a progressive taxation system, this is simply not just a process of increase in taxes. This is a typically very complex process, which can actually be avoided via very, very complex accounting. So there is actually arguments that simply say, well, first of all, what is even the point? Because people are going to avoid it, and what you do is essentially you just penalize the average person more. The average person is going to get penalized more because all the rich people. It doesn't solve the issue at hand. That's basically the disadvantages of it. Foreign direct investment. So foreign direct investment, or simply just FDI, is when an investor from one country establishes a lasting interest in an enterprise located in another country. Now, whilst it sounds simple, this can actually be done in three main ways. You can either do this horizontally, vertically, or as a conglomerate. What's horizontal foreign direct investment? This is when you move your country. You move countries. So let's say you're KFC, and you move. You decide, okay, Americans are cool, but I want more money. Let's go to Japan and let's sell loads and loads of chicken, and everyone has it for Christmas. That's it. That's all horizontal is. Is sort of imagine it. It's the US is here, and you just move across like that. Now, vertical integration, vertical foreign direct investment, is when you invest in your own infrastructure, and this can be done either forward or backwards. So it might be, okay, I am a business operating in the UK, and I want to build more, and I have a clothing brand, but my supplier is a bit inconsistent, or my distributors aren't as good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invest capital, and I'm going to either buy up my supplier, and I'll have more control over that, or I'm going to buy up my distributor, which can help a lot of the supply chain and make your supply chain far more efficient because you have more control over it. You have more say over how it works instead of being sort of left in the dark at some points. And finally, conglomerate FDI is when you just invest in something completely different to something else. So that might be, okay, I'm a huge bank in South Korea, and I'm going to buy up a hotel chain in Brazil. Completely different. Nothing related to your original business activities, but you still invest in it and you still get a tiny profit out of it. So that's basically what foreign direct investment is. I see a lot of motions. I think a big one actually is sort of a banking on foreign direct investment. It's sort of, is it a good idea for developing nations to accept foreign direct investments from international banks? Should they either build up their own domestic banks, or should they allow foreign richer banks into their countries? A very, very common one. That was actually a motion in KCL 2025. I do believe, yes. I remember that. I remember that one. So that's a very common sort of way that might have been done. What are the advantages of having foreign direct investment? The first one is very obvious. You get a huge injection of capital. You get capital and a large sum of easily like money that gives you instant purchasing power, which is great because that means you can suddenly expand your business operations and you can perform better. Secondly, it might be a technology transfers. So instead of having to build a system from the ground up, let's say you're a bank in, I don't know, Senegal, and when you're trying to build up your infrastructure and you're going, okay, it's slow but it's steady, and then suddenly HSBC come along and say, hold on, hold the phone, you can get the entire HSBC system, and we'll implement all the technology. You get the sudden advancement sort of on what our processes is versus your development processes. Could be that. You also get that not only just between, just to clarify, foreign direct investment isn't just between first world nations and third world nations. It can be between two first world nations or two third world nations. So it's not mutually exclusive. Like, it's not only first world. It's not a bottom down process. It can be either way. but that is typically the most common way that is done. And the reasons for that, well, it's more accessible markets, but it's also ideas of sort of neo-colonialism. But that is a whole can of worms, but that's not what we're here to discuss. It also raises the standard of living. And basically, is that when you get this injection of capital, you suddenly your business grows and you're able to compete more. This means that your wages increase, which basically means your profits increase, which you can give more wages, and then people spend more in the economy, so the economy grows, and everything, and it's just that repetitive cycle. The disadvantages of this, and that's what I was kind of tied into, is corporate imperialism, where essentially and this also kind of ties into loss of control. So instead of having individual branches which might have the incentives and the incentives to look out for the nation in which it's operating in, suddenly you have this big corporation who has likely very different ideas on what it wants to do, and their values might not be the same as yours, and which gives you and it also gives you less control as well over what this business does. Even though they have to operate sort of in your market. So, for example, if you are I don't know, a Western Saharan country, and then suddenly a big American bank comes through, even though that you can say, hold on, you need to do the market your way. Typically, what you actually see is you see these businesses almost walking all over these nations because they can do, because they have that much capital and that much influence that they do that. So that it's a huge loss of control for domestic nations. And we can also see that there is a large amount of income inequality. So whilst I did say that it can raise the standard of living, this is not always the case. And why? Primarily because when you have a large business, let's say like a bank, operates in another country, and all the profits, they don't actually have to inject that profit back into the economy. They can simply send it to the home country. So what you get is you actually, even though it's a big business and it's technologically more advanced, you actually might see that you're not that a country where that business has just moved to doesn't see like a single penny of that investment. It all goes back to the original country. So that can happen and it does happen a lot, but it's not always the case. But it does occur. Moving on, this is a big one, and there are two definitions I really want to give sort of with inflation. And I'm sure we all know what inflation is, but inflation is simply just when the value of a product increases, typically in proportion to how much money is in the economy. So the more money is in the economy, typically, there are 100 different ways inflation can occur. But the most simple way is simply the price of a product increases, and that's either because demand for the product increases and the supply is less, or it's simply the fact that the demand stays the same, but the actual value of the cash itself is lowered because there's more cash in the economy, therefore you raise up the prices. I'm very sorry, I should have put a definition in there, but inflation is a whole subject, and I do realize I'm already close to the hour mark. So there's two parts of inflation I really want to cover. The first one is the definition of Phillips curve. And this is a very interesting concept which suggests that there is an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. So what we get is that if you imagine it on an axis, let's say that inflation is on a y and unemployment is on a x, is sort of as the unemployment decreases, so instead of going this way, it's going up. What we see is, I should have put a chart in here to be honest, that probably would have been very useful, is that as unemployment increases, inflation decreases. Because what we get is we get less people buying products, we get even though the supply is the same, demand decreases. Therefore, companies in response lower the price in order to get more people to try to buy. They try to encourage people to buy it. And there's also simply less money circulating in the economy, which means that the actual value of that currency increases because it's more rare, the scarcity increases. However, when unemployment decreases, inflation increases for the exact same reason, for complete opposite reasons. Because there's more money in the economy, the value of the money is less because it's less scarce. And the demand is increasing because people have the money to purchase those products, therefore businesses can increase the price of those products. Um, and then there's the concept of austerity, and this is a sort of an economic policy in like when a nation is facing large amounts of inflation. These are very strict sort of economic policies governments will introduce to try and reduce budget deficits by having either spending cuts, either increasing tax, or they can do both at the same time. And this is a big thing that we see in a lot of debates. And it'll be like, it'll typically be motions on regarding like, okay, in response to inflation, or it doesn't even have to be specifically about inflation. It's still very, very common to see. So, what role does the government play in actually fixing the issues? And that kind of goes back to the previous sort of like, do you go for the classical liberalism approach, like neoliberalism, or do you go for more socialist, sort of like government intervention policies? And austerity is an example of a very liberal sort of policy. And austerity is basically when you have you get this is essentially the government decides that it wants to decrease public spending and they make large cuts. They look at areas and go, okay, we're spending way too much in this one area, let's get rid of it. And this can actually help really restore market confidence. The reason why this does this is because suddenly the government is not overspending in these areas. They might be starting to give like whilst they do increase tax, it's sort of like people have a perception, okay, the market is stabilizing because inflation is slowly going down, and this is thanks to less money being circulated in the economy. Which therefore, when people say, okay, well, inflation is going down and prices are looking a bit more normal, I feel more confident in spending my money on products. Then the economy basically can restart itself. In terms of private sector growth, we see that basically in response to this, private businesses might start to take on these projects themselves. So it's like, okay, something the government might have originally done is no longer being done as a public service. But what we can do is we can capitalize on that and we can actually introduce that service. So that encourages private sector growth. Disadvantages of this. There are a lot, and these are not to be undermined in any sort of way. Like, these really are huge considerations for austerity. The big one is we see a huge stagnation in economic growth. Whilst I did say that you can see private sector growth, this is not always the case. Is that if it's simply like because you're increasing tax, so it's not just reducing the public like spending, you see a increase in tax. So if a government suddenly decides to slap on a 5% extra tax for whatever reason, suddenly people are far less likely to spend the money. Even like small increases in taxes, people instantly have a psychological reaction and they are less likely to spend that money because money is more scarce. So what we see is we see less people actually spending money in the economy. And with these public spendings and these big tax breaks, the taxes not only apply to people, also apply to businesses. And businesses might say, well, I'm sorry, we can't operate at our current capacity, we're going to have to let people go. So it leads to more firings. And we also finally see diminished infrastructure. So it might be, okay, we're going to suddenly have cuts to police, or it might be cuts to the number of ambulances. What this means, or even just fixing roads. So the quality of life in the country does decrease because there's less public spending. The things that public needs are no longer being met because the capacity for those no longer exists. Here's a really hot topic, tariffs. I'm going to, and this is something I've been following along enormously with the whole situation in the US. Very clear, let's clear the water on what a tariff is. A tariff is a tax imposed by a government on imported goods. This is paid by the importer, not the exporter. Very clear, and it's very important to get that out of the way. So if I'm a exporter of sugarcane, and I'm exporting sugarcane to the United Kingdom, and there is a 10% tariff on all sugarcane coming in. I, as the exporter, do not pay that tariff. I don't pay a single dime. I am simply getting paid the same amount. And then what businesses have to do is businesses then have to pay the government whatever the percentage tax is on that product. Now, what happens? Well, it's typically not whilst I will go on to this and disadvantages, I am just going to very quickly say that this cost is then put onto the consumer. Because prices have risen and the businesses have a decreased profit margin, they will increase the price to rebalance that profit margin. That's what happens. So it's not the exporter who suffers, it is the importer. What are the advantages of tariffs? Done correctly, tariffs are actually very useful economic tools. Firstly, they protect domestic and infant industries. What do I mean by this? Whilst you might have heard a lot on protecting domestic industries, this can mean that if you suddenly see a large amount of corporations which are able to utilize exploitative sort of practices, and then let's say you're the United States, and suddenly you get loads of car manufacturers, and they're suddenly doing everything abroad. Okay, what you can do is you say, well, hold on, I kind of want everything to be done internally because that gives me more money, and we have the resources to do it. So that means that instead of other countries getting the taxing the countries and and taxing these businesses, is we can tax them and we can get all that money. So what we'll do is a tariff basically disencourages purchasing from specific foreign powers. So it could be that you have a tariff on these car parts, on these car manufacturing parts, and you simply just don't want them to buy it from Japan, but you still want them to buy from South Korea. So it can either be you want it to be from a specific country, or if you want to protect your domestic industry. And whilst Donald Trump did introduce this idea, and in theory makes sense, the reason why it failed, and just to very quickly clarify this, is because the US had the infrastructure just did not exist for the demand. So it failed on that front. That's why it failed. It wasn't because the tariff itself was a bad idea, it's just when the tariff was being implemented, it wasn't the best idea. It also protects infant industries, and an infant industry is an industry that is brand new. It is an emerging industry. A big one is artificial intelligence a couple of years back. That is an infant industry. It is something that is brand new to the country. And it might be, instead of having a country which might have more resources, that might have greater amounts of capital they can use to spend and enter your country and then dominate, is instead you implement tariffs in the place to stop foreign entities entering and allowing your industry to build up within your economy safe and sound. You put them in a crib, essentially. It's really also good at raising revenue. You simply just add an extra tax that businesses cannot avoid. So unlike how many businesses get away with tax evasion, it is, as far as I'm aware, impossible to get away with tax evasion on importing goods. It's also a very efficient economic tool at retaliation. So what do we mean by retaliation? Retaliation is basically, let's say you have, let's think of an example. Okay, let's take Iran, for example. Iran many fears regarding Iran and its nuclear program, okay, and the amount of potentially developing nuclear weapons. So the UN Security Council and many nations said, okay, if you start to denuclearize and you become complicit with us, we won't slap any tariffs on you. If you continue, however, and you do not allow us to come into your country, and we do not allow you to visit and check whether or not you have nuclear weapons or are building them, we'll slap tariffs on you, and this is going to ruin your economy. So Iran actually complied. Iran is complicit in this. A hot topic, I know, but it is an example, a very classic example of tariffs being used to essentially almost force your opponents into doing something. So yeah, it can be very good as a political tool, or simply if another country's put a tariff on you, you can put a tariff on them. What are the disadvantages of tariffs? Big one, high consumer prices. competitors and businesses and on the importers push the cost onto the consumer. They have no reason not to do this because the consumer cannot get it from anywhere else. It can lead to job losses. So it might be that the country in which was supplying, when they have a tariff slapped on, let's say, let's go for example, let's say Mexico and the United States, is you have this huge sugarcane business and this huge industry, and you have loads of jobs, and your biggest exporter and the biggest person you export to is the United States, and suddenly the United States says, hold on, we're going to put a huge tariff on you, and we're going to get sugarcane from somewhere else. And then suddenly what you get is your biggest exporter, your biggest sort of source of income, suddenly is getting it from elsewhere. That leads to huge amounts of job losses because the business is no longer profitable. We also see that it does increase manufacturing costs. It increases the manufacturing costs for the domestic businesses because suddenly it becomes very expensive to import, and especially depending upon how much the import is from, like depending what percentage the tariff is at. It might simply mean you just have to start making things in-house, but that does mean that you are increasing. You have to start building that infrastructure for manufacturing, so it increases your costs there. One more thing, I did not put this on here, is, and it does apply to the next part as well, but I do want to say that tariffs are a very aggressive political sort of aggravator. It's sort of when tariffs are very publicly announced, and they cause a lot of social disruption. And the best example of this is Donald Trump, is when he's announcing a new tariff. When he announced a tariff on the UK, suddenly the UK government scrambles to try and fix this and appease, but it does not benefit sort of relationships. It always damages relationships between countries because it disincentivizes trade, and that's typically the best way in which countries harmonize with one another. Finally, we have non-tariff barriers. So, unlike tariffs, which is simply a tax, governments have other ways of limiting the amount of imports that they want into their country. You can do this in a lot of different ways. The primary one is import quotas, which basically means you restrict the number of products that can enter your country from another country in 1 year. So if you really love Swiss chocolate, but you have an import tariff, and you can only import, and it says 1,000 Swiss chocolate your company can import, you can only import 1,000 in a year, or in a certain period allocated by the government. They can also do stringent regulations. So this is where they say that there aren't any quotas, there's no tariffs, but they have to meet a certain criteria and certain quality of criteria. An example of this would be the UK in terms of meat. So we cannot import meat from the United States because the United States' health regulations for health are far lower than that of the UK's. They typically use steroids in chickens, and we don't do that. So even though there's no tariff there, the US cannot export to the UK because they don't meet those regulations. There's also, you can have a lot of red tape, which basically means that there is an extensive process to export to a country. And if your products originate from different countries. So what this means is if you want to export, it might be that you have to it takes months for you to try to get all the application process, and even then it's always updating and there's no point, and you might as well go somewhere else. So it's just sort of like a country basically says, I have a lot of baggage and I'm not worth it. That's what it basically says. And the final way you can do it is you can have domestic subsidies. And this is basically when the government says, okay, we're not going to restrict trade, but anyone who comes into our country, we, the government, are going to compete with them, and we're going to give money to domestic subsidies. So basically, domestic companies in the industries that originated from within their own country. So for example, if you are a US car manufacturer operating in the US government might say, okay, well, we're going to give you a good amount of money, have fun, like spend money. It's like your parents basically giving you pocket money. That's essentially what it is. What are the advantages of, disadvantages of non-tariff barriers? Again, it does increase consumer prices, no matter what. For both any sort of imports or any sort of way to try to restrict imports does increase consumer prices no matter what. This is ubiquitous. You might also get reduced market competition, and basically this just means that you get, your markets compete less. It's because you have less competitors competing, you might get less innovation. You might simply just get one or two companies, and it forms an oligopoly, and that's not really fun. You also, and a really big one I did mention before, is retaliation. So by retaliation, it's sort of like what I meant on the tariff ones. It's you get essentially, even though, how do I explain this? Even though it's not nearly as public, for example, like no one knows what the current import quotas are the UK has. I would really doubt that unless you're an economist or that is like your niche. So, but I'm sure we all know about the tariffs that like the UK, like the US has suddenly implemented on many different countries, and it's because tariffs are more public matters. And even though while non-tariffs like quotas and stringent regulation might be less publicly aggravating, it is it doesn't encourage long-term trade and growth. So it still does disincentivize countries to operate and to trade with one another, and it does damage relationships. So that actually summarizes sort of everything for this lesson. I do hope that this sort of explanation into how these economic sort of policies and principles work. I do hope that the recording came out okay. I did spend an hour and a half talking, an hour and quarters talking on this, so praying to God it does sound and look well. And yeah, I would really recommend you watch through this video, write down these are basic advantages and disadvantages. These are things you can dive into. People specialize and dedicate their entire careers to just non-tariff barriers or tariffs. Like people, you have journalists and economists who spend their entire life on these things. You don't need to know everything. It's just really good to have a decent grasp of how these things work. And I'm sure that when you sort of reflecting upon your previous debates that you might have, hopefully some of these might be things that you have come across. So I thank you very much for watching. Hopefully the next video comes out, I would say, in about a week, 2 weeks. But I really don't want to promise anything because I do like to stick to my promises. And I'm guessing the next one is very likely going to be on politics. I'm guessing that's what it's going to be on. I don't know if it's going to be as extensive as economics, because out of all debate motions, I would say economics is the one I have some of the strongest knowledge on. So no thanks to my degree, by the way, no thanks to my degree at all. I'm not sponsored, I wish we were. But if you are looking for ways to improve your general knowledge in these sorts of areas, I would, if you want my recommendations, I would say, first of all, Investopedia is a phenomenal website for all things economic related. They have everything, they explain it, very neutral. They're great. I would also recommend reading news articles, things like either from the BBC, Financial Times, Reuters, AP News are very good sources. And I would also highly recommend a podcast known as The Intelligence. Whilst it doesn't always focus on economics, it is it's hosted by someone called Jason Palmer. He's an excellent reporter, covers a wide range of topics. It's about 20 minutes, 3 topics a day. Extremely interesting, and they get specialists and while it's not always economics, primarily it is. So it's always up-to-date stuff. So if you are looking for ways to expand your general knowledge, I would really recommend those sorts of those avenues to go down. But I do hope you are watching. If you've stuck to the end, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you in the next video. So thank you everyone, and goodbye.